How many people do we have online? 16, 17? Okay. I will encourage them to ask questions throughout.
All right, I see everyone logging into Zoom, getting connected to audio, so I'll give it just a few more seconds so that everyone can see and hear me clearly. I do have a few announcements I want to get off before we start today's session. Okay. Looks good. All right. Happy Thursday, y'all. Welcome back from a long weekend for most of us. It's always weird coming back on the short week after a very long weekend, but we're gonna survive. It'll be okay. So I have a few announcements before we get into today's session. So bear with me, it won't take that long. First, you should have received an email from me about the alumni reception, but I wanted to provide a little bit more information for those of us watching today. So it will be on August 10th from 5:30 to 7:30 at the Gauge, which is on Michigan Avenue. In the email is also a flyer and a link to the sign-up page. The event is hosted by the Alumni Network Leadership Council, and it's a celebration of your work this summer and welcoming you to the Pili Alumni Network. Please RSVP by August 1st. That's when we have to tell the venue how many people are coming, so that way we can plan to have enough food and drink for all in attendance. It's going to be a great time to network with new alumni like yourself, past alumni, and also advisors are encouraged to be there as well. Any questions? You know where to find me. You should also have received an email about the summer tracking form, along with a link to fill it out. I know we've talked a lot about this. I got a lot of questions. Thank you for all of those who have submitted questions and asked about it. But the link to the page will give you a lot more instructions about how to fill it out. And it's mainly going to talk about what kind of issues you handled, clients served, demographics of clients served, and just a little brief description of the kind of work you've done. That one's not going to be due until Monday, July 17th. I want to give y'all more time to fill it out. It'll take about 10 to 15 minutes as well. Any questions, please don't hesitate to email me and I will be happy to help in any way that I can. The intern and fellow spotlight. So thank you to all of those who have submitted. We really do want to spotlight the great work that you're doing this summer and beyond, but we could always use a few more. So if you haven't filled out a spotlight form, please think about doing so. If you have a question or you need a new link to the form, because I haven't sent it out recently and my colleague sent it out a week ago, please reach out to me via email and I'll be happy to get you connected, and that way you can fill out the form and get some recognition for the great work you're doing this summer. Finally, the American Constitutional Society is hosting their annual Supreme Court Term in Review on Tuesday, August 2nd from noon to 1:30 at Mayor Brown. So that's an event that Pili co-sponsors. It will not be held here at DePaul. It will be at Mayor Brown. They will have a number of constitutional law scholars speaking of everything that's happened this term, which if you have followed has been eventful to say the least. I encourage you to come out. It'll have free lunch. There'll be a lot of attorneys there because it's an American Constitutional Society event. And so you have another networking opportunity to meet more folks in the profession. So if you need more details, it's on the Pili website, but you can also reach out to me via email and I'm happy to pass along any of the details. So now that we covered all of that, let's get to today's session, Serving with Excellence in Legal Aid, Understanding Implicit Bias. So today you will learn about how we can become more aware of our own assumptions, behaviors, and impact, especially when we are interacting with people whom we consciously or unconsciously see as different from us. Our presenter today is Dr. Erin Reeves, who has just one of the most impressive resumes I've seen. She's a great scholar in this area. She's a leading researcher, author, and advisor in this field of leadership and inclusion. Dr. Reeves studied business at DePaul University, attended law school at the University of Southern California, and received her PhD in sociology from Northwestern University. So that is just a broad range of experiences that can really help shine light on this issue. Prior to her work as a consultant on workplace culture, Dr. Reeves practiced law for several years and served as an adjunct professor at Northwestern, where she taught classes on law and society. So with that, please welcome Dr. Erin Reeves.
Awesome, thank you.
And let me set this up for you.
Yep. And thank you all so much. Cool.
function F5.
Oh, yeah.
There we go.
All right, you're good to go.
All right, so we have one lone audience member here, so I'm going to keep looking at her. But I also want to encourage you all to chat any questions that you have as I go through this. This is a topic that is not only quite popular to talk about these days in talking about race and gender and all these other issues, but it's also one of the most misreported topics out there. So there's a lot of information about this topic that's quite inaccurate. So we're going to talk through what is implicit bias, how does it work, all of that today, give you some examples. But Cassandra will read any questions that you chat out loud. And so I encourage you to ask questions as you go through. And there might be, can we see we can't see it, right?
Yeah, because.
No, that's okay. No worries. No worries. Awesome. So I won't have you all submit anything by chat, but let's get started. All right. So let's talk about definitions first. I was very, very disappointed to read the recent Supreme Court ruling in the Harvard decision and the UNC decision. Most of the majority decision, the way that they used terms like diversity and equity and inclusion are just inaccurate, right? And a lot of the amicus briefs that were filed around this were just inaccurate. So let's talk about what these terms actually mean, right? There's three different terms that we talk about a lot. One is this idea of equity, right? Equity is anti-discrimination. Equity is not equality. And I saw this term equality and equity kind of juxtaposed and used as if they meant the same thing, and they mean completely different things. So when people say, well, why are we talking about racial equity, or why are we talking about gender equity? Let me just give the simple example of equity measures exist where inequity existed. We do not have a constitutional amendment giving men the right to vote, right? The 19th Amendment giving women the right to vote is an equity measure. The 14th Amendment is an equity measure. The 13th Amendment is an equity measure. So this idea, especially when you look at some of the Supreme Court opinions, especially when people talk about things like originalism, the problem is that equity is not about, treating people equally, right? Equity is about recognizing where there was an inequity and then putting a measure in place to actually, mediate that inequity. So anti-discrimination and compliance are one thing. Now, inclusion is behavior. So one way to think about it is if we can mandate behavior, it becomes compliance, right? For example, if you're in a school, if you're in a workplace, and there are rules that say you can do this, you can't do this. In a society, we sign social contracts, like I like to drive really, really fast, but I'm not allowed to go beyond a certain speed limit, otherwise I will get a ticket. There are rules that say we can mandate your behavior. Now, if behavior can be mandated, it goes into an anti-discrimination or compliance zone. If behavior cannot be mandated, we put that in the inclusion zone, right? So for example, hate crimes don't go into inclusion. We are not talking about inclusion when we talk about hate crimes, because we as a society have decided that hate crimes actually need to be mandated as not okay, right? But let's think about some of the inclusion stuff that I hear about a lot in the legal profession. Let's say that somebody keeps mispronouncing someone else's name, right? We can't mandate that. We can't say that's illegal, but it sure is not inclusive if you can't actually learn to say someone's name. Or if you walk into a room and you say hi to two people, but you go out of your way to not say hi to other people, we can't mandate that behavior, right? So one of the ways to think about inclusion is self-selected behavior. Now, there are things that sometimes go back and forth between compliance and inclusion. There are things that we sometimes ask people to do, they don't do it, and we decide we're going to actually mandate it, right? there are other things that we no longer need to mandate because people actually know that, or their behavior, their self-selected behavior is actually in line with that. Now, let's talk for a second about what is inclusion. A lot of times, you may have seen recently that people are adding the term belonging to this, right? And the term belonging actually means the same thing as inclusion, but it's sort of the flip side of inclusion. So I can be inclusive of you, and if I am inclusive of you, you feel like you belong, right? So one way to think about it is that we don't get to decide that we're inclusive. We can try and be inclusive. Welcome. We can try and be inclusive. And inclusion is one of those things that we don't get to decide what is inclusive for other people. We have to check in with other people to see if they feel like they belong. If they feel like they belong, that means we're being inclusive. So one of the metaphors that I use, it's kind of like being funny, right? Like I can tell a joke, but you did get to decide if I'm funny or not. I can't come up to you and say, I am funny, right? I can't wake up in the morning and say, I'm gonna tell 6 jokes today and therefore I'm funny. I can say, I'm gonna tell jokes today, but other people get to decide that I'm funny. So I can be inclusive, but the sense of belonging that people feel if I'm not checking in with them, I actually don't know if I'm being inclusive or not. I am a public speaker. I'm really good at playing an extrovert, but I'm really introverted, right? I don't like to people at all. So if I wanted to be inclusive in a way that just worked for me, nobody would hear from me. And I would think I was being very inclusive because my assumption is nobody else likes talking to people either. But if I'm a leader or if I'm trying to be inclusive, this is where the golden rule that we talk about in society actually works against us. We can't treat people the way we want to be treated. We have to treat people the way they want to be treated, right? So inclusion starts with asking people or leaving room to acknowledge that other people may want something very different than you, right? And so belonging is a very deep and important psychological need. It's actually on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It comes right after this idea of security, right? When we don't feel like we belong, it actually takes a lot of cognitive and emotional energy to not belong. People ask me sometimes, how do you know if you belong? You don't think about it. It's just like any other need on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You know, when do you think about needing air? When you don't have it. When do you think about needing water? When you don't have it. When do you think about needing security? When you don't have it. When do you think about needing belonging? When you don't have it. Right? If you don't think about it, that means that you do feel like you belong. So anti-discrimination and compliance is mandated behavior. Inclusion is sort of self-selected behavior. So what is diversity? Diversity is the outcome of compliance and inclusion, right? You can't diversity something, right? Diversity or representation is what happens when we are compliant with equity measures and people are inclusive. And so that's one of the reasons why I started off by saying this the Harvard case, the majority opinion is so rife with so many misrepresentations of these words, right? Like when they talk about, well, you can't, diversifying a population can't be a goal. Well, diversifying isn't what you do. What you do is how you select. What you do is how you do outreach to students, right? So, and then also what you do is the inclusive behaviors of students and faculty in the school have a big impact on who actually matriculates. So without focusing on equity measures or inclusive, what you're saying is you don't get to diversify. Diversification is not a goal. You can't take race into consideration. So it's really important to start with what these definitions actually are. So another way to think about it is explicit bias. If something is explicit, we can mandate it, but we can't mandate things around implicit behavior, right? So implicit bias is actually what creates something in us called the intentions actions gap. This isn't just related to inclusion, it's related to everything in our lives. It's one of the reasons why over 70% of people in the West make New Year's resolutions every December 31st, and why 90% of them are no longer actually working on them by January 31st of the very next year. Why? Because we make our New Year's resolutions with the conscious part of the brain, but our behavior is actually unconscious. So unconscious bias, it just means programmed behavior. It's not prejudice, it's not discrimination, it's programmed behavior. So for example, every single one of us, I think, has implicit biases for typing. When we first learn how to type, it's a very conscious process, right? You've got to figure out where the keys are. Eventually, you have an unconscious pattern of your brain knowing which finger to send in what direction by simply thinking of the letter. So we can type really fast. More importantly, we can type without looking at the keyboard. We have unconscious biases for any route that we've traveled more than 3 times. It's one of the reasons why there are places that we can sometimes leave one location, drive to another location and get there and have no recollection of the drive whatsoever. Because our conscious brain was not part of thinking about that. We have unconscious biases towards tying our shoelaces, right? Towards eating with a fork. Anything that you didn't come into the world knowing how to do, you learned how to do, and your brain made unconscious, means we have a shortcut for it, right? So most biases are good for you. But unconscious biases also become patterns of how we see other people. And those biases lead us astray, right? So we create a gap between our intention to be inclusive and our behavior, which is patterned after things that we learn. And I'll go through some examples, but Cassandra, any questions so far? All right, I'm gonna just pause for a second. And if there are any questions, if you all have any questions, jump in. We have one more person who joined us live in the room. So if y'all have questions, I'm happy to take them. Otherwise, we can continue. So this is one of the ways in which implicit bias is really misrepresented. It's not a bad thing. It is a brain thing. It's what your brain is going to do. Right? I have had so many examples in my own life of unconscious bias. I'll give you one from about 3 years ago. It was right after COVID. I was in one of those, we all had like our things that got us through bad moods. And one of the things that got me through bad moods was music. And so I had this one song that I listened to all the time. It was a country western song. I listened to all different types of music. This country western song, it was so soulful. It was so peaceful. It just made me feel like everything was going to be okay. So I just listened to the song all the time. And one day my son, who at the time was 16 years old, walked in and said, "Mom, I didn't know you liked him. I like him too. He actually has a virtual concert coming up. Do you want to watch it?" And I was like, not the same person. Whoever you're thinking about, that's not this person, because you and I don't listen to the same types of music. And he said, "No, Mom, this is him." So he pulls up the picture of this gentleman singing the song that has been bringing me a lot of peace for months now. And the picture is of a young African-American man in ripped jeans, leaning against a wall, it looks like in a city, with graffiti on it. He looked a lot like my son. Thoughts of my son don't bring me peace, right? So I'm like, this is not the man that's been singing the song that I have been listening to for the last few months. And my son was like, "Yes, Mom, that is him." And I said, all of a sudden, listening to the song no longer brought me peace, because now I'm picturing someone that looks like my son. Now, I don't know what I pictured when I first heard the song, right? But how many times have we listened to music and then seen the singer and been like, that's not what I thought the person would look like? Because our brain has an automatic pattern. Somebody who sings like this, who sings music like this, must look like this, right? And I didn't know what I thought he looked like, but when my son presented an image, my brain was like, no, that's not what it looks like. So this happens to all of us all the time. Now, no big deal. Who cares what I listened to, how I thought. But what if I was a music executive? Right? If I was a music executive and Kane Brown, that was the young man, walked into the room, I would be like, get out of here. Like, you're not gonna be a music star. Like, you're not gonna be a country western star, right? So some of these may not be a big deal when it happens in our lives, but in the right situation, so every single one of you is gonna be in front of people who have experienced hardship, challenge, maybe even trauma, right? And you have ideas in your head of things like, what is family? What is trauma? How do people act after trauma? How do people act when they're upset? How do people act when they're angry? How do people act when they care about somebody? You have images in your head. And when somebody sits down in front of you and they say, I'm really upset, there's a part of your brain that is making a decision about whether you believe them or not. I do a lot of work with sexual assault survivors and domestic violence survivors. And I can tell you, because I've done studies on this, about how police officers believe or don't believe stories has a lot to do with their own impression of what upset looks like, what scared looks like, right? What, fear looks like. If somebody says, I'm terrified, but they don't look terrified. Where else does this show up? We know it shows up in healthcare, right? Black women who experience pain are less likely to be given pain medication by their physicians than white women who experience pain. Why? Because when the woman says, I'm in pain, a white physician doesn't feel the same empathy, doesn't believe her in the same way, right? Black and Latino children who are in the middle of an asthma attack are less likely to get asthma medication. There is an 18-minute differential on average in the middle of an asthma crisis between when white children get asthma medication and when Black children do, how they're triaged in the ER. That's the difference between life and death, right? So we can talk about these biases in ways that are kind of funny, like me and Kane Brown, right? And the fact that I can't listen to Kane Brown anymore and feel peace because he reminds me of my son. But it's also about how that same patterning can be the difference between who is seen as dangerous or not during a police stop, who is seen as worthy of pain medication or not, right? Et cetera, et cetera. So intention action gap is, I am meaning to be inclusive. I'm not trying to discriminate. I'm not trying to be exclusive. I actually think I'm being equitable and fair and inclusive. But my actions are not aligned because of patterning that my brain is doing that I may or may not be aware of. Any questions, comments on that? All right. So what are the primary implicit bias triggers? Well, human beings are visual creatures. Unless we have visual challenges, the primary sense that we use to monitor the world around us is visual. Then it's audio, right? It's why I gave you the music example, because when we listen to music, we picture somebody singing. We have to. We can't listen to disembodied voices. It's the same reason why when you talk on the phone with someone several times, you have that moment when you see them in person where you're like, that's not what I thought you would look like. I thought you'd be taller, shorter, older, et cetera. It's interesting, after Zoom, we had this issue of not knowing people's height, but we all imagine people's height. So I've gotten a lot of, you're taller than I thought you would be, so I guess I look shorter on Zoom, it turns out. So things like gender, race, ethnicity, age, skin color, physical appearance, and abilities, these are the things that human beings have always had the hardest time with. But let's just take, let's say human beings that pretty much phenotypically look the same. Right? Let's say, Native American tribes, for example, in the United States. What you'll find is even among groups that look alike, they found ways to distinguish themselves, right? So for example, different tribes would actually do different tattoos to say I'm part of this tribe versus this tribe. That need to say, these are my people, these are not my people, is a very deep human instinct. You only ever need to watch a college football game to see how tribal behavior looks, right? Like people show up wearing their tribal colors. You're not just there to enjoy a game, you're there to support your people, which means booing the other people, right? So this idea that we visually, I mean, like think about it. How many of you have t-shirts or some kind of clothing that talks about your alma mater? Or a band that you like? Why? Right? Why would you wear a school's name on it? Because those are your people, right? And we do want to say to other people, these are my people. That's why, you know, one of the biggest money makers at any concert is the merch that they sell. Why? Because people want to say, I went to this thing. I'm part of this people, right? So visual and then audio. Now, everything below the line, so things like nationality, religion, sexual orientation, cognitive abilities, organizational role. Cognitive abilities includes things like neurodivergence, et cetera. Heritage, value systems, education, life experiences. All of these things are influenced, as proven by research, by things that are visible, right? So for example, your nationality, right? Who is more likely to be seen as American? American is a nationality. It's not a citizenship, it's a nationality. Who is more likely to be seen as American? Who's less likely to be seen as American, right? Or like I love when people ask me, I've been told I look racially ambiguous. So people will say sometimes like, where are you from? And I love messing with them because what they really mean is like, what's your heritage? But I'll say I'm from Chicago. They're like, but where are you really from? I'm like, I'm really from Chicago. They're like, but where are you really, really from? And I'm like, I'm really, really from Chicago, right? Because I want them to understand where am I from is different than what is my heritage. But why are they asking me where am I from? Why are they not asking some other people where they're from? Because visually, we are imputing things like nationality. We impute things like organizational role, right? My very first time in court many, many years ago, I had to check in with the clerk, and the clerk said, which lawyer are you here with? And I said, I am a lawyer. And she's like, yeah, but which lawyer are you here with? I'm like, I am a lawyer. We went through this a few times, right? So see something and then something like organizational role is imputed to you. Things like your value systems are imputed to you, right? I'm old enough to remember when it was not okay to have visual tattoos and be considered professional. I'm also old enough to remember when I decided I didn't care about that anymore and got visible tattoos, right? But I get different questions because people can see tattoos. But what's also interesting, just because I observe everything from an implicit bias perspective, is the tattoo on my left arm looks like it could be henna. And so depending on whether people think it's henna or a tattoo, I get very different reactions, right? So again, like think about all the ways in which you yourself are maybe perceived sometimes. And you know it's because of whatever it is people are seeing or hearing. Value systems, education, life experiences, family structure, right? We know that different cultures, for example, see family differently, right? I grew up, in a culture where I didn't realize until my 20s that most people who I called auntie and uncle weren't actually related to me. And I just assumed they were all related, did not realize that they weren't, did not realize most of my cousins weren't actually cousins. But what does family mean? You might be sitting in front of people and say, tell me about your family, or what family do you have as a support system? And they might say, my neighbor. And it might be instinctive for you to say, well, that's not family. Is it though, or is it not? Are you sure? Right? Because if somebody lives in a housing project, their neighbor is their family. That is who they go to. More importantly, they may actually be family too, right? So how quickly are we to say, that's not what I mean, right? Or if you say something like, I don't know, about all the different areas that you work, things like immigration, right? Things like citizenship, things like education, things like drug usage, right? I have a really good friend, her family's in the South. I'm a vegetarian, and they still don't get this, right? So she's like, but you eat chicken. I'm like, no, I'm a vegetarian. She's like, you eat pork though. I'm like, no, I don't eat pork or beef or fish or chicken. She goes, what do you eat? Right? I was like, I eat vegetables. She's like, that's not food. I was like, it is food, and that is what I eat, right? But think about that for a second. Like, what does that mean? So if you say to somebody something like, well, do you use drugs? Well, they might not count marijuana as a drug, right? They might not count something else as a drug. Like, there's just a lot of different ways, especially in legal aid, especially with the communities in which you're working, where your own experience might not come with the definitions that other people use. And implicit bias is a way where our brains see things, hear things that might actually completely change the meaning and might even change what you decide to do to help this person. How long have you lived somewhere? Right? Could be really different based on what you mean by living. Like if they go from place to place to place, they might say 3 years, but they may not have been there in 2 years. It's just another place where they could possibly stay. So these are all things that can come up that you want to be conscious of. So just to and on the next page, we're going to do a quick exercise. But the majority of unconscious biases are actually good for you, right? They're things that once were conscious that are now unconscious, but they are not reliable. They're not bad, but they're not reliable when it comes to assessments of other people, right? The reason I make a difference between they're not reliable versus they're not bad is sometimes we need to use implicit biases in order to make decisions, right? Sometimes we're right, sometimes we're wrong. But they're not always bad because if we see enough things, for example, we learn to rely on it and it may actually be helpful. I remember I was on a Southwest flight a few years ago. It was terrible. It was terrible turbulence. And there was a woman next, I was in the aisle, and in the aisle next to me was like a 2-year-old. And there was a woman, and then she had an infant in the seat on the other side of her. When we hit the turbulence, the 2-year-old lost his mind and was screaming, and then the baby was screaming, and the woman did not, so she took the baby and she handed the baby to me, right? And I was like, okay, right? Now, I am a mom, right? I do happen to love children, but she didn't even look at me after she handed me the baby, right? Because she was focusing on the toddler. And I kind of was just rocking the baby and holding on to the baby until she looked back. Now, we can say, was it a mistake? Did the bias work? Now, it may not have been 100% reliable. I could have hated children. But what if it was a teenager sitting there? She probably would not have done the same thing. And what she was doing was, in an emergency, making the decisions as fast as she could. And sometimes it's okay to rely on our biases, but we should never assume that they're reliable when we rely on them. They're not accurate, but it doesn't mean we're going to get through life with always not relying on them, right? Any questions, comments? All right. So let's do this quick exercise. It's called seeing versus knowing versus remembering, right? So I put an article up here. I want you, as I read it out loud to you, I want you to just think about what you see here. So riot cops used tear gas on blank after blank. Police in riot gear used tear gas to break up crowds in blank early Tuesday after blank. At least a dozen small fires were reported after blank of people, blank, authorities said. Denise Alex Bazunas, a blank police spokeswoman, said that a handful of arrests were made. As many as blank people converged on the blank, and several hundred forced their way inside, blank said. The crowd tore down a blank. What do you see? Do you see daytime or nighttime? Do you see a rural environment, an urban environment, a suburban environment? Do you see people over 80 years old? Do you see 20-year-olds? Do you see mostly guys? Do you see women? Is it a mix? What do they have on? Right? What do you see here? What did they tear down? Where did they go into? As many as how many people converged? How many people was it? Was it 20? Was it 200? Was it 2,000? What did you see here? Right? So this is how we study implicit bias. This is one of the ways in which we do these research reports. So this is a research study where we actually do a study like this, and we ask people what they see. So what do most people say? Break up crowds and they're like a city. Well, how do you know it's a city? Well, because they have a police spokeswoman. Only cities have police spokeswomen. These are actually some thoughts that we would get, right? What they tear down, most people say a statue, a door, right? A gate. What is the actual story? So we actually go through and we see what people say. Now, this is why we say seeing versus knowing versus remembering. How do we see what we see? Well, because the images got planted in our head somehow, right? So what actually happened here? Riot cops used tear gas on Columbus crowds after Ohio State win. Police in riot gear used tear gas to break up crowds in Columbus, Ohio, early Tuesday after Ohio State beat Oregon, this was in 2015, to win the college football championship. As many as 8,000 people converged on the Ohio State football stadium known as the Horseshoe. Several forced their way inside. The crowd tore down a goalpost. Right? We don't see this. Why? Now, interestingly, riot police in the United States, the number one reason that they are called is because of riots after an athletic win. Interesting, right? We don't riot after we lose. We go home and try to drown our sorrows. But when we win, we act up. When we win, we riot. Here's another example of what implicit bias looks like. This was after Hurricane Katrina, and I'll read this. A young man, so these are both Tuesday, August 30th, right? This is also August 30th. This is 3:47, this is at 11:31. AP versus the Associated Foreign Press. A young man walks through chest-deep floodwater after looting a grocery store in New Orleans on Tuesday, August 30th, 2005. Floodwaters continue to rise in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina did extensive damage when it blah, blah, blah. Now this, 2 residents wade through chest-deep water after finding bread and soda from a local grocery store after Hurricane Katrina. Look at the pictures, they're carrying the same stuff. Both of these pictures show somebody leaving a grocery store, right? These reporters were pushing stuff out so fast. They weren't thinking about it. Nobody sat there and said, I'm gonna say this black kid looted. They were just pushing stuff out, but enough number of times you see a black face and looted, black face and looted, black face and looted. When you see police in riot gear, what are you gonna see? You see looting. And you're gonna see black children, young black people looting, right? But riot police are usually called after this, right? These are all images of young white men celebrating after an athletic win. Look how close it looks to what young black men do during a political riot. The pictures are almost exactly the same. This isn't about politics, this is about testosterone. They're setting shit on fire because they have too much testosterone, right? But young men with too much testosterone in one situation are called violent. In another situation, they're called idiots. And what do you do with violent people versus idiots? Idiots, you smack them on the head. Violent people, you shoot them. And that's how implicit bias works. These people are doing the exact same thing. And now that I have an 18-year-old son, I could see him doing this. Why? Because he just had too much. We don't see young women doing this. And neurobehavioral scientists who've studied this now know this doesn't have anything to do with your political opinion, team affiliation. This has to do with when you get a bunch of young men together that are between the ages of like 14 and 28. And you rile them up, they're gonna set stuff on fire, they're gonna jump on cars, and they're gonna break stuff. Right? But what we call it has a lot to do with then how we see them when they do this. If you have any questions or comments, definitely let me know. Because we're gonna talk about strategies. Right? Similarly, like I went to law school at University of Southern California, and after finals, this was back in the day before Tijuana was as dangerous as it is now. After finals, we would drive down to Tijuana, right? I was one of 3 people with cars. So everybody piled into cars and we all drove down. Now people were happy to ride with me on the way there. On the way back, not so much, because although I would carry my passport, my driver's license, et cetera, I was always the one that got pulled over and checked by border police. I'm not Mexican, not Latino at all. I have no Hispanic heritage at all. And I would have all kinds of ID on me, but it didn't matter, right? And so there's just lots of different ways in which we recognize how we are seen. Now, what's really interesting is one of our friends who was British actually had overstayed his student visa. He was here illegally at the time that he was finishing up law school for a good 6 months. He was not legal. Never got stopped, right? And I literally sometimes wanted to be like, him, the car in front of me, go get him, right? But I didn't do that because I actually like them. But, all right. So as you go into, not just go into because you've already been in these positions, but as you think about your careers, we want to talk about, you want a big part of closing this gap between your intentions and your actions is about focusing on your mindset. There's 3 different types of mindset. Fixed mindset is resistant to the possibility of growth. I already know this. I'm inclusive. I don't need anybody to tell me that. I don't have biases. I don't need anybody to explain it to me, right? I've been studying this stuff for 25 years. Every single day I wake up and I say, I can learn something today. If I did not, right? That is exactly the minute we say we don't have something to learn, when we get a fixed mindset, that is absolutely when we are at most vulnerability to be impacted by our biases. Here, we focus on reproducing what's familiar, doing exactly what we see around us, following the crowd. This is the, when we have groupthink, et cetera. Stays within the boundaries of known structures, right? That looks like the way it's always looked. So think about my courtroom experience, my very first day in court. She was like, this doesn't look like the rest, right? Like this does not look like how attorneys have historically looked. Now, a growth mindset is you show up with an open mind. And you say, you know what? I'm about to sit down with somebody. I'm about to do a client intake. I'm not going to assume what I think they know or don't know. Focus on how we can grow, and we embrace challenges. Now, there's something beyond growth mindset that's called a benefit mindset. Benefit mindset actually says, I want to show up for the benefit of everybody involved, which means I'm okay being uncomfortable. Because even people in growth mindset, we can actually be like, all right, I'm getting a little too uncomfortable here. I'm good. Like, I don't really need to push myself. But the minute you say, but if I think of this as a collective experience, what would I do? Right? If you notice, the United States Constitution has a lot about what our rights are. It doesn't say what our responsibilities are. Right? Most of us, even if we're in the growth mindset, we stay focused on what our rights are. What do I have a right to do? Not what do I have a responsibility to do. A benefit mindset is by showing up in places and saying, what is my responsibility in this situation? And a lot of times, my responsibility might be something that may not be 100% in my best interest. But if it's like 90% in my best interest, but it really changes somebody else's experience, one of the metaphors I use for this is, imagine you go to a concert, right? And you got some tickets, you are super excited about this concert, paid a lot for this. You get to the concert and there are two really tall people in front of you. You can't see the stage. Now, they have a right to be where they are. You have a right to be miserable, right? You do not have a right to tell them to turn around and switch places with you. And they absolutely have a right to not pay any attention to you. That's what rights feel like. Benefit mindset is when you go to a concert, you look around and you're like, how is everybody else around me? And if somebody's shorter behind me, right, is my view going to change if I flip with them? No, not at all. But their view is about to change dramatically. So me saying, okay, my responsibility is different than my right. My right is I can stand in front of them and block their view. I paid for the tickets just as much. I'm not at fault for being here, and there's nothing, I'm not doing anything wrong by standing here, but am I doing the most right thing possible? It's a different mindset, right? It's very difficult to get from fixed to benefit. We do need to go through a growth mindset in the middle, because if you're not willing to grow, it's really hard to get to this. And benefit mindset, you're not going to stay in it all the time, right? There are plenty of times I'm just too tired. I don't really care about everybody else's experience here. I just want to get home, right? Or I just want to go to sleep. So you don't have to stay in this all the time, but it's good for you to just be like, what mindset am I in right now? And there are times where it may make sense to be in a fixed mindset, right? For example, there are times I do a lot of work with law enforcement, with military. Sometimes a fixed mindset is what keeps you safe. Stay within the structures. You don't know what you're dealing with right now, right? Growth mindset is great in a classroom. Maybe it's not always great when you're out there in the real world. And benefit mindset, you know what? May not be the best thing when people in the room may not have my best interests at heart, right? What if they're out to hurt me? Oh, man, I'm running. I'm not trying to be in the best benefit of all of you if what you want for me is harm. But how do I know that if I get stuck in the fix? If I'm assuming you mean me harm, instead of being enough in the growth mindset to figure out, right? Like, these are the things that we want to practice. So what are some concrete things that you all can do on a regular basis? Two things that will get you out of implicit bias on a consistent basis. One is curiosity. Curiosity and bias cannot exist in your brain at the same time. Neurologically impossible. Why? Because when I look at you, my brain, not consciously, but unconsciously, has decided it knows where you grew up, right? So if you tell me something like I grew up in North Dakota, I would be like, huh, that's surprising. Why is it surprising? Because I made up something in my head that isn't the truth. But if I say, as soon as I walk into a room, if I say I'm curious about where you grew up, my brain will not fill it with that. The example that I showed you with the story about Ohio State, the minute if you said, I'm curious about what happened, you would actually inhibit your brain's ability to put in details, right? To actually do this when I worked with law enforcement sometimes, like, I'm curious about what's happening here. Because if you don't say that, your brain is like, I know exactly what's happening here. And then off you go. and you're making the decisions. And I'm curious why this is happening. It's also a great way to start a conversation with somebody. I'm curious why you feel that way. As opposed to, I disagree with you or you sound like an idiot, right? Take time to say, I don't know. I don't know. I don't know what that person's life is like. Most of you are going to be in front of clients. You have no idea what their lives are like. You have no idea what they're going home to. You have no idea the danger and the kinds of risks that are going into them making the decisions that they're making. You don't know. It's a beautiful empathy triggering mechanism to say, I don't know. I don't know. I've done a lot of work with white nationalists and the Klan and the Aryan Brotherhood. And I always say to myself, I don't know what caused a young man to want to do this. I don't go in and say, right? Like, I don't know. They weren't born that way. And so one really interesting thing I figured out, because I did a lot of this research as part of my PhD, is guess why young white men become part of white nationalist movements? It's actually almost the exact same reasons as to why young Black men join gangs. City of Chicago, city of New York. Those are the two cities I studied. Almost the exact same reasons. They're looking for the same thing. It's just different people are serving it up on a platter and it looks different. That's when I started studying these pictures also of what riots look like, right? And so we don't know. It's too easy to say, that's bad, that's wrong. It's harder to say, I don't know. So what that usually does when you say, I don't know, is it triggers this, well, I wonder what? I wonder, I'm curious about. We cannot say we're inclusive if we're not curious about people who think very differently than us. And in a world that we live in right now, it's too easy to find people who think exactly what we think and feel so good because we're knocking down other people and saying, well, we're better, right? Because that's no more inclusive than the people that you're criticizing. Focus on maintaining a 2-to-1 ratio of questions. You want to, especially when you're talking to people whose experiences are very different from yours, ask more questions. Don't assume, just ask one more question. What do you mean by that? How do you define that, right? If someone just says, you don't understand, I can't do that. Why can't you do that? Right? How does that work? Like, the more questions you ask, the more you're doing this. One story that I was working with some emergency rooms a while back, and this one doctor told me of the story that really kind of humbled him. He had a child who was coming into the ER every weekend in diabetic crisis, right? And he came in with his grandmother and his aunt, and he would, the doctor would treat the kid and say to the grandmother and the aunt, y'all gotta feed him, you gotta do this, you gotta do that. And the grandmother and the aunt would be like, you're right, you're right, you're right, we will, we promise, we will try, like we'll do this. Next weekend, kid would be back. And, you know, the doctor was like, okay, I'm gonna call social services because you all are not taking care of this kid, the kid's gonna die, right? And it was an all-white ER team, but there was one Black doctor, and this was a Black child, Black family. And the doctor said, but he was a resident, and he said, can you give me a chance to talk to them? And the attending was like, this is cut and dry. This isn't a perception. They're not feeding the kid regularly. And he said, yeah, but I grew up in a poor family. Let me just talk to them. So he went and talked to the family and he came back. He sat the attendings down and he said, the kid goes to school during the week. Kid has lunch and breakfast and a snack at school. This family's so poor they don't have food. The grandmother and the aunt are doing their best. But the reason the kid's coming in every weekend and not during the week is because by Saturday night, is the diabetic crisis is starting again because they don't have enough food. And the grandmother and the aunt, whatever food they can get, they're giving to him, and what food they do have isn't nutritious. It was an issue of poverty, not of neglect. But it took somebody else who had been in an impoverished situation who said, but every time this kid is in crisis, the grandmother and the aunt are here with him, crying. This is not a family that doesn't care. Let's not call social services and create more trouble for this family where there is none, right? And so they were put in touch with a food pantry, had a nutritionist work with the food pantry to get them weekly deliveries of food, and the kid started doing better. But it takes somebody to say, wait a minute, what's actually going on here? Instead of saying, we tell you to do this, you're clearly not doing it, that's why you're back here with the kid, okay? Focus on maintaining, asking more questions. Be curious about how people got to that point, not just where they are, right? How did they get there? No, you all can't see this, right? So this says be curious about other people's thought processes, not just their conclusions, right? So if somebody says, if you're recommending something to somebody, and let's say they're like, I can't do that. That's not a possibility. And you're like, you have to. And they're like, I can't do it. Just say, okay, walk me through how you came to that conclusion. Like, what are the different things you're taking into account to that? Because you may not, the conclusion might feel off, but you may be able to intervene in step 1 or step 2 or step 3 of their decision making. Yes?
How do you maintain that same perspective when you're dealing with ignorance?
How do you mean? So one of my favorite sayings in the world is, if you argue with an idiot, there are now 2 idiots. Okay? When you deal with ignorance, you have to let go of the idea that you can change ignorance. We cannot educate people who do not want to be educated. But it feels really good to try. It's actually a really good dopamine hit to argue with people. It's actually as strong as like a hit of cocaine on your brain. The amount of dopamine that it produces, that your brain produces to argue with somebody that you disagree with, is a pretty strong high, and we like chasing it. So you have to decide, what is my purpose here, right? Is it a situation where you have a responsibility to speak up, right? And when you speak up, you cannot speak up to try to change someone's mind. You have to speak up to change behavior, not their beliefs, which is very important, right? So I was in O'Hare one time, and there was this older white man who was just so mean to this person who was cleaning up. She was an older Latina woman. And I had no idea what was going on. My job is not to teach this man manners. My job was not to convince him how ignorant he was. But in that moment, I felt like, as another passenger, here's a passenger, I could at least acknowledge it. So I just said, dude, that was rude. Not, did you know you were rude? I was like, you should apologize. And he was like, I'm not about to apologize. I said, well, I'm crazy. I don't know what I'm going to do if you don't apologize. I wouldn't suggest you find out. Well, what was I doing? I was being stupid, right? In that situation, all I wanted is for her to know that somebody saw it and knew that it was wrong. Was that going to change this guy? Absolutely not. Was he going to be rude to the next person that he saw? Probably. My goal, he never did really apologize, but my goal in that, I felt like I needed to speak up for her. So she knew somebody saw her, not because I was trying to change his behavior. So you have to really ask yourself, is the expenditure of energy in a particular situation worthwhile? And sometimes it is to change somebody's behavior. Sometimes it is to make the person who's hurt in the situation know that they are seen and that they are heard and that they are valued as a human being, even if they weren't by the person saying that. But if you argue with an idiot, there are now two idiots. It's one of my favorite sayings in the world. It keeps me from a lot of arguments. Any other questions, comments? I know we're at time and I want to be really conscious of people's lunch hours, et cetera. But if people do have questions, if they email you, they're welcome to email me, email questions, and I'm happy to take those questions. But did you all have any questions? I know it's harder to sometimes ask by Zoom. No? All right, well, thank you all so much.
Perfect. Take this. And thank you so much, everyone, for your time. That concludes our session for today. I'll see you next week.
All right.
I seriously would recommend that you all make everything virtual, because at least people can can chat.
Mhm.